In a world where kingdoms fall and stars still remember names, this song was forged from magic memory and the dream that refused to die. Welcome to a tale where wonder still breathes. This is the short story, The Night and Its Three Stars, a story of light, love, and destiny for my Buell created by Pacampara. If this tale stirred something in you, a memory, a dream, or a truth, our Ko-fi, Amazon, and Patreon links are in the description. Support helps us keep writing for you and the ones you hold dear. They say there was once a knight who was weighed heavier by silence than by steel. His name was Jess, and though he bore the marks of victories past, his heart was a map of scars more tender than triumph. To the world, he was a figure of duty, but to the wind that knew his breathing, he was a man asking if love was enough to stand against night. The elders told of a sword forged from the breath of stars, a blade that only answered to the pure of heart. Legends claimed it would ignite when touched by a savior's hand, blazing with it the truth of destiny. And when Jess reached for it, the sword dimmed, as though refusing to remember its own fire. The lords declared him unworthy. The bards turned their eyes to fresher names, and the halls of power closed like stone around him. Yet fables do not always live in crowns and coronets. Sometimes they begin in the small courage of three voices who did not let him fall. The Princess Buell Wee in Young placed his hands. It was not a relic, but a common sword, plain as a farmer's tool. Carry us here, they said, pressing his chest where the heart does its quiet labor, and it will remember. And it said that he rode into the winter with their fate bound to him, snow treading in his cloak, doubts like wolves in his wake. The Bible tells that when he whispered the name, Buell, the iron glowed not like fire but a lantern lit by love. Children still ask, when the sword is drawn in their storytellers' voices, was it magic or was it love? And the answer always is that love is the oldest magic and the truest. So begins the tale of a knight who failed the legend but lit a sword with his own heart, and of the three princesses whose fate carried him into the fortress of thorns, where his name would either be forgotten or remembered forever. Snow hushed the world to a single breath as Jess rode through the valley. Frost feathered in his bridle and turned the horse's mane into a pale river. His pauldron caught a thin moon and gave it back, less brightly scoffed to a tender mate. And the hands of years could taste the iron on the air, storm and blood, and the odd flavor of choices made and paid for. The trees bowed over the road like monks, their black ribs burdened with white. Some were ahead beyond the sleeping fields, and the wind that sounded like a hymn half remembered rose the fortress of thorns where three names lived in his chest like lanterns, Wee in Young and Buell. He had been given the sword of legend at dawn, and the watch would sicken at the touch of his palm. Runes like frozen lightning went dim, divinity receded, and every noble eye around the stone court found a way to look anywhere but at him. He remembered the murmurs like cold fingers on the back of his neck, unworthy, spent like a night whose star has gone to ash. It would have been almost fun if he hadn't got so near the bone. There was no funeral for lost faith, only errands, so they sent him anyway without the blessed blade, with only a warning to be quick and not to be seen failing. It was the princesses who intervened, a quiet corridor that smelled of heart, smoke, and beeswax. They pressed something plain and human to his hands. Wee did it first, her fingers trembling as though they too wore shackles. Not every light begins as a flame, she whispered, eyes big as the first stars. Young's blessing followed, spoken like incense. Carry us in your heart, and the still will know. Buell smudged stood from her cheek with the back of a hand, and grinned like someone who would arm wrestle fate for a joke. If it breaks, I'll stand beside you unarmed, she said. That's how much I believe. He rode with her fate wrapped around the handle like a second grip. The river came up out of the fog and braided itself beneath his horse's hooves. Reeds brushed his boots, brittle with rime. He said their names into the mist, the way a man tests the bridge. Soft, measuring what will hold, and nothing had changed. Then, because his silence had begun to sound like an accusation, he tried Buell's name with the care of a musician finding a note in the dark. Buell, the word left his mouth as a thread of warmth, and the ordinary sword breathed and breathed where it rested on his thigh. Not a blaze but a breath, water-taking moon, a candle capped in his palm. His throat tightened, he said it again, and the still answered, light deepening into a clear, tender star. By the time he had reached the fortress, snow had begun to fall in fat, slow petals. Thorns grew from the earth like a black sea captured mid-storm, their hooks lacquered with ice. The gates were two trees whose trunks had grown together in a marriage of cruelty. Somewhere beyond he could hear the low animal moan of an old wind, like a narrow place. He dismounted, the air tasted of iron urgently now. Shadows gathered, they rose from the seam between the gate roots and the ground, thin as incense smoke and many-voiced. They wore the court's whispering tones and the scorned smiles of a tournament yard. Unworthy, they said, a knight without a flame, a man who carries only the echo of a name. The sword's glow faltered, dimming to a bruise beneath the leather. His breath came, white and ragged. Doubt is a snowdrift that looks like ground until the step. It took him for a moment. He did not see the thorns. He saw himself at dawn, half full of eyes, a legend coming out like a candle in the wind. He put his brow to the pommel, as though begging absolution. The metal stung. He welcomed it. Snow ticked against his neck. He closed his eyes and went only to the chapel he knew would open. Memory. Buell laughing too loud in solemn rooms, in the way she had always fixed her errors with both hands and no apology. Wheaton's careful niceness, an art as exact as archery, and Young's prayers shaped like ladders, holiness that did not self itself above. He remembered Buell's voice when she said she would fight unarmed beside him, like someone promising to meet at noon at the market, certain at the path. He said her name the way the body says breath, the smallest true thing, Buell. Light threaded back to the steel like dawn through the shutters. It broke upon the gate with a patient press, and the thorns eased, every barb shivering as if cold had finally reached it. The trees groaned, the seam widened. He stepped into the corridor that smelled of old rain and crushed vines, and something faintly sweet, jasmine of all impossible things, blooming where winter's mouth showed deep. The fortress was a maid that had forgotten it was not a forest. The glass tower shouldered up to the bramble near the inner court, its skin breathing the pale light in 100 small sighs. Wheaton was there, cheek to pain, breath and breath, fogging like a circle, and she drew into one of her fingertips. She had counted snowflakes until her numbers ran out, and then begun at one. When the light bleached the thicket below, when the ordinary sword sent a quiet daybreak into the roots of things, she swallowed the sob too precious to throw away and whispered, "He came," and the word made constellations in the glass. She remembered him kneeling once in a stable to comfort a groom weeping over a dying mare, humming to some old lullaby, blackbirds singing in the dead of night, until the fear loosened its grip. He had always been gentler than his armor suggested, but the gentleness is sigh and does not raise banners. She had wanted the world to see it, and now the world was a room made of windows, and she did. By the time Jess reached the base of the tower, the sword's hum had set, hairline starburst tracing through the panes. He lifted the blade and said Buell's name again, almost an apology for what must be done, and almost a prayer for permission. The glass parted like a held breath and released. He found Wheaton in a chamber full of light. She was smaller than he remembered and stronger. You took too long, she said. Which is how some people say I am saved without frightening the fragile moment that follows. He bowed like a clumsy man, remembering how to dance, and held out his hand. She took it without bravado, squeezing his fingers as if measuring the temperature of his resolve. Young waited not in the tower but in the garden, strangled under winter, a place where the earth had been taught to bite. Thorns grew out of thorns, snow caught on them and made the lace that cut. Yet jasmine bred and breed here, thin and stubborn, a miracle or a memory so strong it impersonated one. Young knelt with her palms pressed to the ground as if introducing it to prayer. She did not ask for release. She asked that Jess's heart not be bullied by the world into hardness. Let this mercy be armor, she said softly, and this strength a door that opens. She remembered him in her father's hall, bowing low, lower than pageantry demanded, because the old lord addressed liked to be seen by the knees after a campaign. She remembered being angry at a world that requires gentleness to kneel, and then relieved that someone had brought gentleness to a room that smelled like ambition. When Jess shouldered to the barriers, the sword's glow went cool and clean, the color of water before a storm. Forgive me, he said to the plants, as if they were men, and the jasmine answered by releasing a breath of sweetness so sharp it watered his eyes. The thorn loosened around Young with the delicacy of untangling hair. He lifted her free. Blood made red beads where the spines had kissed her palms, and she hid her hands, embarrassed, until he took them both and bowed his forehead to them as if they were relics. Your prayers found me, he said, and perhaps they will keep you. She answered, and he felt something invisible bind around his lips and hold. And then Buell sat at the heart of the keep in a room whose walls had learned the geometry of cruelty. Chain left patterns on her wrist like bracers and bracers from an unkind world. She had spent the hours inventing jokes, and she would tell later to make the worst days less sharp. Remember where I fought a wall and the wall lost, and planning how to heckle the first person who brought her soup. She had also sometimes closed her eyes and replayed the moment she had put the plain sword into Jess's hands, deciding over and over to believe that choice, as if belief itself was a bridge you had to cross daily so the boards would remember how to hold. The door did not open so much as it decided that it had been a door all along. Jess stood there with the snow still dreaming on his cloak, in the light in his hand that came from nowhere, where a legend would admit. You took too long, she said, because the line was theirs. Now the smile was a relief, throwing his hat in the air. I had to stop and ask directions, he said, and they both laughed like people meeting on the far side of a risk. When he said her name, the chains opened like old friends who had misunderstood everything. The light in the blade answered the warmth you feel most fiercely in winter. Not heat, but whom. He reached for her and felt the weight of who had been and who had failed to be, who shifted to one side so he could stand up straighter. She stood with him, shoulders back, as if there had never been a shackle made that matched her measure. They left the fortress by a road that had not existed before they walked it, the priors turning meek as old cats along the edges, the glass tower shedding its last starburst like dandelion seeds into the sky. Snow had ceased, leaving only the smear and the smelling of metal and the clean earth. The sword dimmed to a coal and then brightened again. When Buell laced her fingers with his, it seemed to like that. Just wanted to object to sort legend from love, to insist that he was only a man fortunate enough to be given a second try at his own courage. The word stumbled and made no proper line, so he did the thing that had worked at the gate. He put his brow to the hilt and whispered the smallest true thing. Buell. The blade brightened as if someone in the sky had lifted a shutter, and the finger's breath and the road ahead found its own edges more clearly. They camped where the torn field gave way to a meadow that would be green in spring. Wind built the fire with the competence of 1,000 small kindnesses. Young brewed something mint and sweet in the dented tin. Bill roasted chestnuts and burned the first tree so gloriously she could claim that it was a style choice. The sword lay between them like a stubborn star. Just sang a little, not a night's march, but a sort of tune you hum in the kitchens, snatches and scraps that made the night softer. Being joined on the chorus of vaulting about comets and sailors. Bill tapped rhythm on her knee. Young closed her eyes and let the sound stack itself like bricks around the quiet. Tell the truth, Wayne said, when the fire turned to coals. When did you know the blade will glow for her name? At the river, Jess said, when the fog didn't argue with me for once. Typical fog, Buell said, very agreeable when I'm involved. I said all your names, Jess continued, softer though not less certain, but love is not a democracy. Wayne made the mock-wounded sound smiled fully. Good, I like the version where love is a bell that chooses a single wind. Young poured the last of the mint into his cup. And I like this version, she said, where being chosen by love does not make the others less essential. Wheels do not turn without each spoke. Buell nudged Jess's boot with her own. You hear that? You can love me loudly and honor my sisters without tripping over mythical furniture. I will try to not stub my toes on destiny, he said. The laughter that followed was the sort that you keep because it belongs to every year after. When they reached the city, bards were ready, as bards somehow always are when a story arrives with frost still in its hair. They tried to attach the old sword to him, to relight the legend as if it had only been sleeping. Just listened with the politeness due to the people whose work is remembering, and then he showed them the plain blade and said nothing, merely spoke Bill's name and let the light dilute the afternoon into something tender. The crowd made the sound people make when their hearts are briefly taller than their bodies. Bill pretended to curtsy to a cabbage. Wayne cried openly. Young's head bowed as if in prayer, though he knew that she was only taking the world for cooperating. That night, after the feasting gave way to the kind of quiet that magnifies small noises, Jess would rise and take the sword to the window. He would say her name like someone grateful to have found the key in the pocket he always checked last. The blade would glow enough to find whatever had been misplaced. Courage, humor, the path to bed when you are too tired to remember which door you used. On some evenings when the city's breath slowed, he would say the other names too. We in Young, and though the steel did not kindle at their syllables, he felt some inward room grow larger and look more like a home where winter could not overstay. He went on rescues afterward, some public, some not, some as simple as retrieving a child from a well of shame, some as absurd as convincing an old general that he could forgive himself without a trumpet. The sword answered at his had been taught to love, to laughter at the edge of fear, to prayer solid enough to stand on. There were days the iron tasted and returned, and the world tried to be a hall full of ice. On those days, he did exactly what he had done at the gate. He put his brow to what he carried, said the smallest true thing, and watched the dark remember it was only night. And yes, when they teased him, he took it gladly because teasing is the silk that keeps the truth from chaffing. Fallen for the trickster princess, Wayne would say, tying a ribbon to her own point. Destiny Young would correct, laying a hand where the ribbon made a small defiant plug. Bill would kiss him like a woman who had once promised to fight unarmed, and now she found that she did not have to, which made the kiss louder in all the right ways. The sword would glow, a little private aurora ripping up its length, and in that light they would look briefly like what stories keep promising we can be. People whose hearts know their names and choose them again every day anyway. The bards kept trying to give heaven credit. Just let them, because heaven is a good worker who doesn't need the praise. He knew what Blade had always known. The miracle was smaller and nearer. Love is about speaking a name into winter, and winter learning how to give it back as a light. And when the vows were spoken and sealed in the hush of their kiss, Jess drew the sword, not the blade of myth, but the plain one they had given him. He whispered their names into the silence, Yongsun, Byulyi, and Viin, and at each name the sword glowed brighter until its light filled every corner of the chapel, not with fire, nor with the thunder of gods, but with the warmth of a home lit against the night. The people who gathered that day swore that the glow never faded after, so long as just kept their names in his heart. And so the fable closed, not with a battle or crown, but with a love spoken aloud, each syllable a spark and each vow a flame. And when children ask why the sword glows in the old stories, the answer is always the same, because love unnamed remembers itself as light. I make these tales and bits of chaos daily for my beloved Buell. If they made you laugh, feel, or even just shake your head in disbelief, hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe. Let's keep this wild, heartfelt ride going.